Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Einar, and I'm a researcher and designer based at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And fittingly, in many of the kind of topics that come up today, what I develop and teach is interactive and digital design. But what I'm mainly going to talk about today is research that me and my colleagues have done in sort of the intersection between design culture and urbanism. We have specifically been trying to sort of investigate or reveal how technology takes place in the world around us and how it sort of becomes part of urban life and of everyday life. Today I will show some of these explorations and I will try to raise some questions about how urban technologies have cultural and sometimes creative implications. Over the last decade or so, these sort of interactions with digital networking technologies have become largely naturalized through GPS maps, electronic ticketing, and social media, sort of mobile devices that bring online and urban practices together. The kind of phones in our pockets become ever more present in almost kind of everything we do. Across academia and industry, this digitization of the urban sphere is often regarded as some form of networked cities where wireless networks and sensors and algorithms and antennas are sort of making up the background of the city. Fernberg suggested that instead of regarding these technologies as platforms or discrete tools, it makes sense to think about them as environments. He writes that sort of we live today within the technologies that organize our way of life. And I suggest that one of sort of the key technologies that we are living inside today are the networks themselves. But although sort of networked cities are increasingly present in daily life, the sort of technological foundations of them are largely invisible. They are either sort of physically unseen, such as radio waves and satellites, or very difficult to access or comprehend, such as data centers and communication protocols. The architect and technologist William Mitchell observed how this sort of electromagnetic terrain is intricate, it's invisible, and it's only sort of hinted at by the presence of antennas. And as well as sort of being technologically invisible, everyday interactions with mobile devices and urban systems are becoming taken for granted. Within cultural studies, Highmore observes how when new technologies like the phones in our pockets become embedded or absorbed into everyday practices, they sort of fade from view and take on a form of a cultural invisibility. We suggest that for sort of understanding urban technology and culture, it is important to investigate and also question the relationships between these forms of cultural and technological invisibility and the forms of tensions and often biases and politics that they give rise to. The emergence of the networked city has been conceptually and theoretically contested with sort of competing visions of how and for whom the urban technological future could or should be developed. And the dominant vision across industry is that of the smart city, that proposes to use technology to optimize urban planning, urban governance, and aspects of daily life. It's typically represented in popular culture through mediated visions, such as Microsoft's vision of the future of productivity, as we see here, where sort of your calendar appointments are projected onto buildings in taxi windows. But what you typically see here is sort of a promise of a city that is made more efficient and more seamless by the use of network technology. At the same time, kind of proposed smart city systems are being developed and implemented around the world, such as the IBM's Intelligent Operations Center for Rio de Janeiro, which is shown here, which involves a very complex infrastructure for collecting urban data using sensors and using this data to optimize allocation of resources, planning, and specifically for security operations and control. And these forms of visions of a smart city has been met by critiques that question what these forms of pervasive urban control systems will affect urban life. And we should perhaps ask how this form of smart city, who is it for and who does it actually benefit? Is it for citizens or is it for the corporations and institutions that use this data to organize very specific forms of order from above? It kind of raises the question of how urban technological spaces are planned and realized and within which contexts. It also prompts the question of what kind of networked urban, creative and cultural life is made possible by the emergence of new technology. And sort of importantly, how the emergence of the networked city can be situated in the cities we have today, as opposed to some future smart city envisioning. So in a research project called Immaterials, my colleagues and I have been exploring and trying to charter the contemporary invisible electromagnetic terrain of networked life, and trying to sort of create new forms of cultural expressions of networked urbanism. This is a project kind of created by a number, kind of network of designers and researchers, funded by also a network of research project that comes from sort of interdisciplinary contexts spanning architecture, art and urbanism. It's a project that consists of a series of films, a series of bits of online culture that visualize technologies that are crucial to today's urban life and yet poorly understood outside of technological fields. The central part of this project that I'll show first is a project about wireless networks, about the basic core phenomena that makes the phones in our pockets work, kind of the background phenomena of the background of daily life. In a film sort of called Immaterials Light Painting Wi-Fi, we have sort of developed a technique for visualizing these networks. Wi-Fi networks are interesting in many ways. They are an international standard protocol for wireless communication that uses high-frequency radio to transmit data. Wi-Fi networks are relatively large and typically reach to about 100 meters, which means that they operate on an architectural scale. And in many ways, Wi-Fi networks are as significant as the built environment. And if each wireless network is typically connected to the web, making the physical space an extension of our global communication network. Over the last 10 years or so, Wi-Fi networks have become something that we find almost everywhere. But we only really come across them through sort of complex technical interfaces like this, and also then mainly when they fail. Sort of our perception of them is hugely technically oriented. It's based on encryption protocols and password protections and signal strengths that don't really tell us very much. So we have developed a technique for trying to visualize these and communicate it as online film. And I'll show you a segment of this film first. So what we see here is sort of the development and use of a technique and an instrument for looking at the sort of spatial and materially structurally aspects of wireless networks and how these are shaped by urban spaces. To create these images, we have made a sort of a classic surveying instrument, a surveying stick with a row of lights on it and a sensor that detects Wi-Fi signals, and the stronger the signal is, the higher the bar of light. This is then moved through space and photographed with a long exposure time, and we get these sort of light paintings, these kind of cross sections of signal strength. As we kind of see in the process here, light painting is an interesting aesthetic technique that has been used for over 100 years to look at phenomena that we can't see. The Gibrits used it around the kind of First World War to map out movement patterns of factory workers to see how to make factory work more efficient. And it's been used kind of by Millie to look at the ice skaters or the helicopters and so on. But it's also an interesting technique in that it's photographic. It takes place in an urban space. It's an urban photographic technique in this case, which means that we can see both the visualization, the measurement of the network and the space at the same time. This is not a simulation of what the engineers would suggest that it would be, and it's not a calculation. It is like every piece of light that goes up and down is a piece of the network that's being detected. And also the size of them is meant to emphasize the architectural scale of it. Wi-Fi networks are, in a sense, prototypical examples of the networked city. They have several of the kind of characteristics that illustrate challenges and possibilities of digital urban life. First, they are sort of invisible, they are ubiquitous, they are complex, and they are ever more commonplace. And they also sort of importantly take place inside the existing urban fabric. When you kind of visualized networks across Oslo, you first of all found out that they were almost everywhere, but they're also very different. The architecture, the building materials, and traditions of the city affect how this sort of wireless terrain is shaped, showing us that sort of the networked city is both global, but it's also highly local. What we see here is a brick wall from the 1890s, creating a sort of a shadow in a network coming from the left side of the wall. The strength and sort of consistency of networks also reflects the size and status of their host. Like a small domestic network, as we see here, kind of barely stretches beyond the facade, while a massive institutional network, as the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, kind of crosses a campus and sort of disappears beyond into a park. But because this network then is password protected, it makes this kind of networked space then both technically and practically inaccessible to most citizens. Through sort of this imagery, the goal or the research here is trying to sort of contextualize technology by making it visual and spatial, pointing out where it takes place. But it also, kind of in our experience, points to the lack of a form of design language for invisible technology, or for sort of shared images to discuss technological cities around. All of our sort of projects are, as I said, so they're published and distributed online. That is the sort of form of design we work in. We use media as the mode for communication. Online media and online film then becomes sort of the probe that goes into the world and travels around. The films and imagery has been viewed upwards of 20 million times, and kind of has gone into quite a lot of different sort of groups, from kind of conspiracy theorists all the way through sort of technology and art and politics and industry and a lot in education. And through this we try to propose that a form of culturally oriented exploration, or artistic exploration of technology, could be used as sort of an example of how to directly engage with the popular imagination of the networked world, providing ways of making technologies both visible and, in a sense, culturally accessible. One of our latest projects is called Satellite Lamps, and is about exploring and visualizing the urban landscape of satellite navigation, or GPS, the global positioning system. And the history of GPS goes back to the launch of Sputnik in 1957. And today the GPS is a constellation of around 33 satellites that are operated by the US Department of Defense. These satellites broadcast radio signals that allow devices with GPS receivers to calculate their own position. And this is done through very complex geometry and satellite orbits. At its core, GPS is importantly a very, very militarized navigation technology. And as many of the kind of technological systems from the internet and onwards that we have today, it's in a sense a product of the Cold War. The first GPS satellite, NAVSTAR 1, was launched in 1978 atop of an Atlas F rocket, and the system was in a sense kind of fully operational in 1995. And it's an interesting example of how global military politics and sort of everyday phenomena today are sort of intermingled. They come together. There's no real kind of material difference on the GPS on a phone and in a missile. It's both sort of, GPS then becomes both a part of urban life and a part of the kind of technological superstructure that is in a sense much larger than our planet. It's sort of, GPS is the biggest machine we have. In 2008, Apple included GPS into the iPhone, and that kind of represents a very big shift in how network technologies work. Because now it's possible for the phone to calculate its position, meaning that when we tap our phones, there's usually satellites in the other end in real time. But before this, you would usually, users or consumers would typically encounter GPS in cars, where it connects to digital maps. But when it's put into a smartphone, it connects to the web itself, making that you have a very specific pinpoint connection between the entire web and a physical location. So the map and the network comes together. And this has brought location into lots of different sort of applications, from sort of the obvious things like navigation and traveling, but also kind of creating the backbone of contemporary dating applications or fitness applications, or even kind of looking at stars. But there's something really interesting that happened when GPS goes into urban life and into a pocket, as opposed to a whole car, in that it becomes pedestrian in a sense. It is able to receive signals, but it's not able to do it very well. To get an accurate GPS position, you need a clear view of the sky in multiple directions, which is quite rare in cities, specifically when you move across the city, when you move into buildings and so on. This generates, in a sense, shifts of accuracy and kind of edges and seams in how our phones think our phones think they are. With this kind of project called Satellite Lamps, we have tried to look into detail about what that actually means. Why is it so, like when we design applications for smartphones, we very often find out that location doesn't really work. It doesn't work as we think. So we built these lamps. These lamps have satellite GPS receivers in them. Depending on the accuracy of the signal, they change the brightness of the lamp. We've taken those into urban environments. We photographed them over time using time-lapse photography, meaning that as the satellite moves, the accuracy changes, and the lamp's able to detect that. I'll show you a short segment of a film of what this looks like. So GPS changes how we use the city, but it's also shaped by the city. And these sort of satellite lamps are probes into urban space, where their flickering shows us how the physical urban landscape obstructs the digital landscape. Through this kind of probing process, we have looked for the inherent seams and edges of satellite navigation in cities, trying to find the spaces where satellites don't reach, trying to find the sort of prototypical kind of errors that engineers would find if they started looking at this. And articulating how sort of common forms of architecture specifically work against the principle of GPS. Like here, where a portal of a 1930s apartment building creates a very specific shadow that moves a little bit over time in the differences we have between one lamp being on, the one in the portal is off. This means that if you walk through there, you would have a distinctive drop in satellite coverage. As with the Wi-Fi visualization, the satellite lamps try to emphasize the local and spatial and somehow sort of material nature of networked cities. The lamps show us that in urban life, GPS is not a seamless blanket of optimized or smart location technology. It's sort of an ongoing negotiation between satellite geometry, radio waves, architecture, and our own individual movements through the city. The lamps can also be seen as sort of beacons for a sort of invisible electromagnetic terrain. They are, in a sense, a sort of celebration of this overlooked technological spectacle, but could also be used to illustrate sort of critique of the visions of power relations that typically comes with this. I find it sort of fitting to end with Nikola Tesla. And Tesla sort of invented alternating current, laying the foundations for the modern electrical society. But importantly, he also attempted to popularize the excitement of electricity by drawing attention to the spectacular possibility of electricity through his visions, to demonstrators, to imagery. However, in the late 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, as electrical grids and appliances are beginning to stabilize, this sort of initial creative excitement of electricity faded away. By the First World War, kind of electricity was seen as more a necessity than anything else. And today's network technologies are in a similar place. They are fast disappearing from view. In use, they are becoming naturalized, they're becoming mundane, and very often constrained. And while their cultural expressions are becoming sort of normalizing, they're becoming sort of typical hyperbolic celebration of proposed seamlessness or efficiency. And I suggest that there should be a potential to use design or art or other forms of creative explorations to shape or stir the popular imagination or the popular expectation of what networked cities can be. And this sort of represents a kind of a cultural challenge to how we engage with emerging technology in cities and across culture. The technologies of networked life are sort of increasingly sophisticated, yet we do not have equally sophisticated cultural materials for engaging with this. And this, I suggest, sort of limits the potential for discourse, for invention, and for critique. And there's a need for better concepts, for better languages, for better sort of tools for understanding and imagining these technologies. And importantly, there's a need for opening up for several ways of reimagining sort of the creative and often political possibilities and challenges of future networked life for a broad range of people and interests. Thank you.